Just woke up. Gotta get this video done. I'm talking about audio filters today, guys. What's going on, everyone? John from the Elite here. A lot of you guys seem to want me to make a video on this, so I'm the nice guy. I'm gonna go ahead and do that for you today. Format's pretty simple. I'm gonna start off by showing y'all how to add filters within OBS. Then after that, I'm gonna give you guys a big rundown on how the filters work at a very basic level. There's some specific parameters that you can adjust on these filters that I'm not going to go into today. I'm going to save that for a separate video, as a lot of them are related as far as how they work. I'm going to be focusing on the stock audio filters that come with OBS Studio, Streamlabs OBS, and OBS Live, because, you know, I'm basic as f. Seriously though, it's because I feel that these plugins actually offer enough where they would make a noticeable improvement for your audio, so it's actually worth learning what these different plugins do. And I made some fancy little animations too to help you guys visualize everything a little better. And of course, one quick thing before we get going, if you do like this video, please be sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below. Let me know what you thought of the video, and share this with your friends if you know anyone that would actually find this information useful. As per usual, there will be links down in the description below, along with timestamps, so you can jump to the part that applies to you the most, and well, we go ahead and just get right into it. Okay, so fortunately for all of you, adding filters in OBS is really simple, and there's actually a couple of different ways that you can do it. The most common way that most of you are probably going to be adding filters to things like your mic source, for example, would be to go down to the audio mixer and then look at the gear icon on the right-hand side of that particular track that you want to add filters to. Go ahead and click that, and then you'll see a drop-down menu pop up. Scroll down, and you'll see the filters option. Go ahead and click that. And then you'll see this window pop up here, which will allow you to list all your different filters on the left-hand side. You click each filter, and you'll see the parameters for each filter there. If you want to add a filter, you simply click the plus icon on the bottom, and then you'll see a drop-down list pop up, and then you choose the filter that you would like to add in. You can add a name to it if you would like to, and click OK when you've named that, and you'll have a new plugin added in there. By the way, sometimes you'll hear me refer to them as plugins. In the audio world, that's what we typically call them. We call them plugins or VSTs. OBS just happens to call them filters, probably just to make things a little simpler for those who aren't specialists in this area. But hey, that's what I'm here for. I'm here to teach you these things. If you want to remove a filter, all you got to do is highlight the filter that you want to remove and then click the minus button, and it'll remove it from the list. Now, there's one last thing I need to show you before we move on here. Looking at this list, I want you to think of the audio as moving through this particular list from top to bottom. The input starts at the top and the output comes from the bottom. This is important because your filters are going to be processed in a particular order, and sometimes you'll get different results depending on the order that your filters are in. You can actually change the order of the filters by highlighting whichever filter you want to move and then clicking the arrow buttons. I'd highly recommend that you experiment with this because you will yield very different results depending on the order that you have your plugins. This is what's called a signal chain, and the way that you route your signal chain should be heavily considered when you add filters into your audio. This is just a basic audio production thing, but it's going to make a world of difference in terms of helping you get the sound that you want. Because here at Elite, we're just not about that scrub audio life. Now, of course, I had stated that there are multiple ways that you can add filters. But of course, adding filters is not exclusive to the audio mixer. You could also add filters to specific sources that you have added to your scenes. And if one of them happens to be an audio source, you just right-click that source, scroll down, and choose filters. Brings you to the same menu. And believe it or not, you could actually do the same thing with video sources. OBS also has different video filters that you can add. Although I don't recommend that you use too many of them to try to save processing power, sometimes adding a video filter to your source can make a world of a difference. But that's a topic for a different video. And before I forget, one last thing I want to mention about the filters here is that if you want to turn filters on or off without removing them, you can just simply click that little eye icon, that eye-shaped icon to the left of the filter name, and you can disable it. This is a good way to check to see if the changes that you've made to your audio are good or bad. Just turn them on and off and listen back to the audio you've recorded, and you'll see what kind of effect that the plugins have made. In the audio production world, we call this the bypass button. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, I gotta show you guys some basics of waveforms. You're probably thinking to yourself,
but John, I don't want to learn this. This seems like something I don't need to know.
Stop. You came here to learn, and your boy's here to teach you a little something about audio filters. If you want to make sense of this, you gotta learn this first. Take a look up in the corner of your screen over there. This wonderful piece of third grade art is what I would consider to be a waveform. See, those little After Effects tutorials are starting to pay off, huh? Those aren't just a bunch of squiggly lines that you're looking at up there. Allow me to insert a trigger warning down here for any of those who got PTSD from learning math in grade school. You can basically look at this picture as if it's a graph. On the bottom section of the graph, basically going from left to right, that's time. On the left side, that's 0 seconds. On the right side, that is more than 0 seconds. On the left-hand side, that pretty much refers to the volume of the particular audio that you're looking at. And you notice that the numbers go up and down with a big line going through the middle. The line in the middle basically represents infinity or no volume. And the number values always go from a negative to 0 dB. This is just the way that audio is measured. And anytime the volume goes above 0 dB, it gets into what's considered clipping territory. The reason why the numbers go up and down like that, it has to do with the way that sound waves work. Sound waves are just vibrations that move through the air. So basically me talking is kind of like waves going up and down like this, kind of like in and out, pulsing like this. They're vibrations. The top part of the line above the middle line is what's called the high pressure wave, and the bottom part's what's considered the low pressure wave. The reason I'm even telling you this has more to do with the fact that it's going to help you understand what you're looking at, but it's not really going to affect your understanding of what these plugins do. The main thing you need to know is that the bigger that the peaks are on either end of that line, the louder the audio is. And the smaller the peaks are, the quieter the audio is. So anytime you're looking at this graph and you see really tiny squiggly lines, you know that the volume's really low on that particular piece of audio. If you see big peaks, you know that the volume of that particular waveform is really loud. Fortunately, just about all of the audio filters I'm going to be showing you today have to do with adjusting the volume of these waveforms, and they all do it automatically for you. In the audio world, we call this adjusting the dynamics of the audio. And when it comes to waveforms, that's all you really need to know about them. So let's move on and start talking about the first filter. First, I want to talk about the gain filter. Understanding a gain filter is pretty simple. Basically, what it does is it allows you to increase or reduce the loudness of a particular audio source. Whenever you turn the gain down, you do reduction. There's a pretty low likelihood you're probably going to use a gain filter in this fashion for most streaming applications. However, an application you might typically use it for is to actually increase the perceived loudness of the source. Whenever you turn the gain up, that increases things. And I also want to mention one thing about gain. If you're wondering what's the difference between gain and volume, there's only really one difference between gain and volume. They both have to do with loudness, but gain has to do with the input signal of the particular audio source. Volume has to do with the output signal of the audio source. You could almost think of your microphone as an input source, which it is, and then the output source might be considered something like your headphones or what people are hearing on your stream. It's two different types of volume there. You can adjust the volume of the source going into OBS, and then you can adjust the volume of the source going out to your stream. That's how you should think of input and output when it comes to audio. And that's basically what the main difference is between volume and gain. This is definitely one of the simpler filters that you can use in OBS, and one of the typical reasons you might use this is to increase the volume of your mic source if it's not coming through loud enough. Some microphones have limits, and they will not go louder than a particular volume. Sometimes it just has to do with the mic either being cheap or just having very limited volume increase options, or maybe you're just soft-spoken. Sometimes you just need to boost the signal source, and this is probably one of the best ways you can do so. I do want to say that if you can avoid using a gain filter, I would definitely do your best to try to avoid using one. Only use it on a needed basis. Now when we get into talking about the almighty compressor. This is by far one of my favorite filters or plugins that I use in audio production. It's used for so many different applications, and it's so basic in how it works. Yet at the same time, you could just hold a masterclass on compressors by themselves because they can do so much for changing the sound of your audio. But to explain what exactly a compressor is, all it really is basically just an automatic volume adjuster. In the animation, you'll notice this red line coming down. That's basically the threshold of the particular compressor. The threshold basically specifies at what point the compressor will turn on and do its thing. The threshold also works in conjunction with the ratio of the particular compressor, which tells the compressor how much to turn the volume down. Any audio that goes above or at the threshold line will get its volume reduced. This is a great way to help control any sort of loud peaks in your audio that might be much louder than most of the other audio in the source. Most of you will probably just use it for this particular reason, so that way you can kind of just keep the really loud parts from getting too loud on your stream. But some people might actually use this in a fashion where they want to make the audio fairly uniform across the board. One way that you can do this is if you take the threshold and bring the threshold way down So that's at the point where it's about even with the quietest parts of your audio. You then set the ratio to a moderate level so you get a lot of volume reduction happening. And I'll turn up the makeup gain to kind of make up for that loss of volume that I have. And it also actually brings up the quieter audio as well. And now you look at the waveform and you'll notice that it's a lot more uniform. This is actually the one main thing that you hear in that sort of broadcasting sound that you hear at a lot of people's microphones. It basically just helps to make sure that your quietest audio is not so quiet that it can't be heard on a stream, but your loudest audio isn't so loud that it blows people's eardrums out. It brings everything down to a more uniform level and makes things a lot easier to control on your stream. Before we move on to the next filter, I should mention you will see attack and release sliders on these particular plugins. I'm not going to get into that today. That's a completely different topic for another video. You can go ahead and play around with those if you'd like to. But to quickly summarize what those do, those basically tell the compressor how soon to turn on and do its volume reduction, and how long to stay compressed until it goes back to normal. Like I said, it's worthy of a video on its own, so let me know down in the comments below if you'd like me to make that video next. And of course, one last thing before moving on to the next filter, the one last thing I should mention about compressors is that sometimes they're used for a process that's called side chaining. Basically, you can take a compressor and add it to like the audio of your desktop audio, for example, in your OBS source, and then you can have it read the volume of your voice, and it will adjust the volume of the desktop audio, for example, to duck down whenever you speak, and then it'll come back up whenever you're not speaking. I will be making a video on this if you're interested in it. Of course, comment down below if you want me to make a video on that. Next, we're going to talk about limiters, and to be honest with you, this is probably something that all of you should have on your signal chain. Typically, I put the limiter at the very bottom of the signal chain, right at the very end, and the reason for this is because a limiter is basically a super extreme compressor. Technically, you could set up a compressor to behave just like a limiter. All you need to do is set the ratio super high and then you get limiting. But one of the main things that limiters are used for is to prevent the audio from ever exceeding a particular threshold. You'll notice in the animation that it probably doesn't look wildly different from the compressor, but when you see that red line come down, you notice that the audio on both the top and the bottom of the waveform get completely cut off. In the audio world, we call this brick wall limiting. And it basically just completely prevents the audio from ever exceeding that particular loudness. One of the main reasons you're going to want to put this at the end of your signal chain is to prevent your output volume from clipping. Output clipping is never good. If I ever catch any Elite members with clipping output audio,
I'm about to give you the smackdown.
with all seriousness though, guys, like you really should have a limiter on there. There's no excuse for it. It's the simplest plugin to use. Just set your threshold to like, I don't know, -1 decibel. And then just leave it alone. You'll be doing a lot to save your viewers' ears. So just put it on your signal chain. Okay. All right. Now we're going to get into talking about expanders. Expanders were recently added, probably about like, I'd say 6 months ago to OBS Studio. And to be honest, when they first came out, I thought they were kind of redundant, but after doing a little more research, because honestly, I didn't know what an expander was until about like, I don't know, 6 months ago when they came out. When you're a self-taught audio engineer, it's funny what you learn and what you don't learn in your journey. But when I finally learned what it was, it all made sense, and I actually see that there are some practical uses for using an expander. Simply put, you could almost think of an expander as a reverse compressor. Basically, wherever you set the threshold, all of the audio below the threshold is going to have its volume reduced. Where a compressor will reduce the volume of anything above the threshold, the expander does the opposite. They both do volume reduction, they just do it in a different fashion. So basically, you could use an expander to take the quietest parts of your audio and bring it down even more. It just makes things like, for example, adding a noise gate a lot simpler, which we'll get to next. But expanders are also really good for podcasting environments where you have multiple people with multiple microphones. You probably don't want to be using a gate in a podcast setting, but you definitely want to use an expander. It just makes it a lot easier to isolate a person's voice and do some processing to it, while also cutting out background noise. I should also mention, if you have a problem with controlling background noise in your room, you might want to consider using an expander. And you're probably going to want to use it pretty early in your signal chain as well. And you also definitely want to consider using an expander if using a gate is considered pretty troublesome. If you find yourself cutting off like a lot of words early or late in your sentences, an expander could just help make your gate's job a lot easier to do. Now let's move on to noise gates. You could almost think of this as a reverse limiter. Just like an expander, anywhere where you set the threshold, all audio below that point is going to get completely removed and cut off. So a noise gate is perfect for trying to filter out things like keyboard noise whenever you're on stream. It's especially good for filtering out background noise if you have a loud room or you have like a fan or an AC that's just constantly humming in the background. There's another filter that we can use to try to combat that, but we'll get to that in a second. Just know that a noise gate could be used for that particular application. If you're just a lone streamer, you know, just by yourself on stream, doing your streaming thing, I want to say that gates are probably essential at this point, especially if you're a PC gamer and you have your mic within earshot of your keyboard. A lot of people tend to get irritated by hearing a lot of background noise when they're on stream, and they'll complain about it. Give them a reason not to complain. And of course, before we continue, there's one thing I need to mention about noise gates is that you'll notice that there are two sliders. There's an open and a closed threshold. The open threshold is the point where the gate will allow the audio to go through so that people can hear it. The closed threshold is when the gate will close off and then close off all audio. The gate will not work if you set the closed threshold higher than the open threshold, or if you set it to the same thing. You always want to make sure that the closed threshold is lower than the open threshold. To try to help you understand this a little better, you'll notice that when you look at the waveform that the audio goes up, and then it comes down. Think of the open threshold as when the audio comes up. That's when the gate will turn on, and then the closed threshold handles the audio when it's coming down towards the quieter side. That's when the gate will completely cut the audio off. You do need to play around with these two sliders to get it just right so that you're not cutting off your sentences early or late. So play around with this and take your time with it. All right, now we're going to talk about a particular filter that I have some rather controversial opinions on. We're going to be talking about noise suppression, and this is actually a useful plugin. However, my big beef with it has to do more with its functionality, but we'll get to that in just a moment. To explain what a noise suppressor does, it basically looks for frequencies based on where you set the threshold. So you can almost think of this like a gate in terms of how it works, or more like an expander. But instead of just flat out removing things based on volume, it removes things based on the frequency content of the actual audio source. Pretty much the way you would set this up is that you would look for a point in your audio where you're not speaking and there's just background noise. For example, if you have like the fans on your PC are super loud and they're getting picked up by your microphone, or if you have fans or ACs, noise suppressors will basically try to hone in on the frequencies that this background noise occupies, and they'll try to remove it across the entire audio source as a whole. So typically when you use noise suppression, if the background noise is so severe, it could end up having an effect on the audio that could end up degrading the quality of the audio. This isn't always the case, especially if you're in a good environment where it's easier to filter out the background noise. But when you're in a really loud environment, you start to make some really heavy sacrificing using this particular filter. The amount of frequency content that'll be lost as a result of using it might be so much that it might not even end up being worth using. And getting back to my big complaint with the way OBS's noise suppression seems to work, I tried to do some research to see exactly how it was that it worked. From the little information I was able to locate, it seems like what it does is that it references the threshold that you set volume-wise to determine what frequency content gets removed. So anything below that threshold, it's going to look at the frequency content that's below that threshold, and it's going to attempt to remove it. Now, in theory, this should be enough to do some effective noise suppression. However, there are other plugins that I find do a much better job of this by actually analyzing the audio before it does any reduction, instead of just basing it on volume. Honestly, this is getting into some pretty technical stuff here, and it's really difficult for me to explain this in a simple way. But my best advice for using a noise suppression is that, like, you use it in a situation where the noise, the background noise in your audio, isn't so loud that it interferes with your audio. Basically, you're just using it for cleanup, kind of like a small touch. Like, use it if your background noise is significantly quieter than your actual speech. And this kind of references to my previous video where I mentioned to bring your microphone closer to you. It helps for plugins like this. And honestly, when you're setting up your signal chain, I would experiment with the order between your expander and your noise suppression. See which one sounds better or which one helps it be more effective. There's probably a very special circumstance where I might use my expander first and then put on my noise suppressor to try to like hone in on that noise a little better, especially if that background noise is fairly loud. But that can yield really weird or wonky results sometimes, so I'd be very careful with that. Moving on to the next filter, we got Invert Polarity. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because honestly, most of you probably won't benefit from using this. If you look at the animation up above, all this really does is that it takes the polarity, or the high and low pressure waves of the sound wave, and it just flips them 180 degrees. In the audio world, we call this flipping the phase. And a lot of the times when we play around with the polarity of a particular waveform, it has to do with checking for what's called phase cancellation. I want to say that phase cancellation is both a basic yet advanced thing that you need to learn in audio, and it really only applies to very specific situations. It technically applies to streamers as well, but it only really is useful in situations where you're using multiple microphones. If you were to take like a basic mono source and just flip the polarity of it, it wouldn't sound any different to you. It's only when you take two sound sources that sound very similar to each other and you flip one of them from the other one, that's when you'll start to notice its effect. So for most of you, you can honestly just ignore this particular filter. And lastly, I want to touch on the VST 2.x plugin. This is actually one of my favorite features in OBS. What it allows you to do is it allows you to add third-party plugins to use in OBS Studio. There's one thing that I do want to mention. If you use Streamlabs OBS, you'll notice that this is available to use as a filter within it. The problem is that it's not technically supported by Streamlabs OBS. The problem you're going to run into using this plugin in Streamlabs OBS is that you're going to get everything set up. You'll have your third-party plugins set and ready to go. But then once you close out Streamlabs OBS and open it up the second time, none of your settings are going to be saved on your third-party plugins. Only OBS Studio and Stream Elements OBS is going to save them because Stream Elements OBS is just an extension of OBS Studio. I don't understand why Streamlabs OBS decided to can support for this, seeing as that so many people want to use their software and want to use third-party plugins, especially considering that EQ plugins aren't available unless you use VST 2.x, and no one's going to want to have to set up their EQ every time they go live. And honestly, that's the biggest reason I don't use Streamlabs OBS is because it doesn't support VST 2.x plugins. They'll work the first time you use them, but once you open Streamlabs OBS again, sorry, bud, you have to set your settings up again. So for all you Streamlabs OBS users out there, just ignore this plugin's existence. It's a waste of your time. Unless, of course, you're okay with setting them up every time you start up Streamlabs OBS. And that just about wraps up this video, guys. I hope you all found it helpful. And if you did, please be sure to like, share, and comment down below, as that helps with the visibility of the video so people can find it. And also help spread the good word of the Elite. For those who don't know, the Elite is a brand new streaming community that is all about helping you become the very best that you can. We all band together to try to help you learn various skills that you need to become a better streamer and a better content creator. Everything from marketing to technical setup, networking skills, personal development as a content creator. All this stuff matters to us, and we like to use processes like gamification to keep things interesting. We just recently launched a website, which we will link down below, but if you would also like to get some more details, you can join the Elite Academy Discord. There you'll be welcomed by an amazing community of people that want to help you become the best streamer that you can possibly be. In the process, you can learn how to join the official Elite team. Regardless, we would just love to have you as a part of the community. Also, be sure to check the description for various social media links. They'll be down below for you to check out as well. And of course, if you would like to stay up to date with everything that goes on the Elite YouTube channel, please be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon for notifications. You'll be notified anytime that we upload to the channel. I appreciate y'all taking the time to watch this. Thank you very much, and have a pleasant day, everybody.